Well, this series just became a whole lot more interesting, or at least I hope it just became more interesting. When I started watching this game, the Wolves were up 38 points late in the third quarter. Let me tell you, that's not just winning, that's making a statement. It's one thing to win Game 3 at home when you're down 2-0 in the series, but it's an entirely different beast to dominate the way the Wolves did tonight. What we witnessed wasn't just a victory, it was a complete dismantling of everything Oklahoma City had been doing successfully in the first two games. The Wolves didn't just win this game, they made some crucial defensive adjustments that OKC was absolutely not ready for. You could see it in the Thunder players' body language as the game progressed. They looked confused, rushed, and frankly out of sorts. Meanwhile, the lid that had been firmly placed on the Wolves' basket for the first two games of this series finally came off in spectacular fashion. Players who had been struggling to find their rhythm suddenly looked like the confident shooters we know they can be. This wasn't just about making shots, though. This was about completely changing the complexion of this series. Let's dive into what the Thunder were trying to do offensively, because the numbers tell a fascinating story. In the first half alone, Oklahoma City attempted 22 three-pointers. Now, one of those was a desperation heave at the end of a quarter. So let's call it 21 legitimate three-point attempts. But here's the thing. If they had maintained that pace for the entire game, they would have been on track to attempt over 40 three-pointers, which would have been significantly more than the 20. They shot in Game 1, and noticeably more than what they managed in Game 2. Now, to be completely fair to the Thunder, they averaged 39 three-point attempts per game during the regular season. And in today's NBA, a team shooting 43s in a game is completely normal. That's not the issue here. The problem was that these shots felt different. They felt rushed, forced, and uncomfortable. It seemed like OKC was constantly going to their plan B, or even plan C on offensive possessions, as opposed to getting those clean, wide-open looks, where a shooter has all day to set their feet and fire away with confidence. The Wolves had clearly made adjustments that were forcing the Thunder into uncomfortable situations, and it showed in their shot selection and overall offensive flow. What we saw from the Wolves defensively was them daring Thunder shooters more than they had in the previous games, and it was absolutely brilliant to watch unfold. They were leaving AJ Mitchell completely wide open in the corner, which might sound crazy, but it was a calculated risk that paid off. They were obviously playing way off of Lu Dort, essentially inviting him to beat them with his shooting. But the really interesting part was watching Anthony Edwards help off of Jalen Williams and kind of stunting at Shai Gilgeous-Alexander to get the ball out of his hands. Then pulling an OKC move right back at them by quickly recovering and closing out to Jalen Williams himself, while really pressuring the basketball. You also had plays where Rudy Gobert was positioning himself higher up on SGA screens than he had been in the previous games. We'll get into that more in detail later, but they were also conceding Chet Holmgren popping out for three-pointers. However, and this is crucial, Dante DiVincenzo was still closing out hard on those Chet threes. So even when they were giving up the shot, it was still a decently contested three-pointer. This approach was dramatically different from the previous games where SGA was essentially doing whatever he wanted around the free throw line area, completely unchallenged and comfortable. The defensive changes went far deeper than just help defense, though. Many people on Twitter have pointed this out, so I'm not going to act like I'm the first person to notice this. But the Wolves made a conscious decision to not pressure SGA as high up on plays, giving themselves a much better chance of staying in front of him. Jaden McDaniels especially was fantastic in this regard. There were several plays where Jaden actually went under screens on SGA and simply met him at his spot, completely taking away his preferred driving lanes. You also had Rudy Gobert positioning himself significantly higher up on some of those SGA or Jalen Williams screen actions. I guess you could technically call it a high drop coverage where he might start backing up as they're driving. But that's fundamentally different from him just waiting for them at the basket like he was doing in the previous game. Remember, in that last game, the Thunder shot an absolutely crazy percentage on jumpers and floaters around the free throw line area. There were multiple plays in this game where Gobert, being positioned higher up on these screen actions, forced SGA to either pick up his dribble or make questionable passes in midair, because he simply was as comfortable with Rudy positioned closer to him than he had been previously. The Wolves also showed some wrinkles we hadn't seen much of in this series. There were times when Anthony Edwards was super aggressively switching onto Lu Dort, essentially hunting that matchup and daring Dort to make plays. You had Gobert pressuring Isaiah Hartenstein at the three-point line, which was a bold strategic choice. Most interesting of all, there were several instances where Gobert was trapping SGA on-screen actions completely out of nowhere, which I don't think we had seen them do a whole lot of in this series with Gobert as the trapping defender. All of these adjustments combined to make Oklahoma City extremely uncomfortable throughout the entire game. The Thunder looked confused. Their offensive flow was completely disrupted, and they never really found a rhythm on either end of the floor. It was a masterclass in in-game and between-game adjustments by the Wolves coaching staff. They identified what was working for OKC in the first two games and systematically took it away, forcing the Thunder into uncomfortable situations and shot attempts they didn't want to take. The beauty of these defensive changes was that they weren't just reactive, they were proactive. The Wolves didn't just try to do the same things better. They completely changed their approach and forced Oklahoma City to adapt on the fly, which they clearly weren't prepared to do. On the offensive end of the floor, the Wolves finally got the shooting performance they had been desperately needing. Nasir Little, Dante DiVincenzo, Jaden McDaniels, and Nez Reid. All of them shot the ball exceptionally well from three-point range. It was like watching a completely different team than the one that had struggled so mightily in the first two games of the series. Anthony Edwards was also significantly better on his pull-up threes off-screen actions, which has been a shot he has been going to frequently throughout this series but hadn't been connecting on consistently. Julius Randle got back to doing his thing as well, which was crucial for the Wolves' offensive balance. When Randle is playing well and being aggressive, it opens up so much more for everyone else on the team. His ability to attack mismatches and create for others was on full display. And you could see the confidence flowing through the entire roster as shots started falling and the offensive rhythm improved dramatically. For me, though, the biggest factor in this game was still the defense. Yes, obviously Oklahoma City is going to come out with a much better effort in the next game. Just the nature of playoff basketball. But considering how much we've seen the OKC defense bother the Wolves at various points throughout this series, if Minnesota can consistently do the same thing back to them, then at the very least they can turn this into a rock fight where both teams are struggling offensively. Of course, we have to acknowledge that swings in three-point shooting are always going to be a significant factor in modern NBA games, and there's no doubt about that reality. The cynical take on this particular game would simply be, hey listen, they had to win this game, and sometimes this just happens. One team needs a victory way more than the other team, and the basketball gods smile upon them. It's certainly a valid perspective, and there's probably some truth to it. However, I genuinely feel like the Wolves discovered something important in this game, something they can potentially build upon and replicate. The defensive adjustments weren't just lucky breaks or random variants. They were systematic changes that clearly bothered Oklahoma City throughout the entire game. The way they pressured different players, the way they rotated, the way they positioned their help defense. These weren't accident. They were deliberate strategic decisions that paid dividends. At the very least, Game 4 now becomes absolutely crucial for both teams, and that's fantastic for the series as a whole. The pressure is completely different now. Instead of OKC potentially going up 3-0 and having a stranglehold on the series, we're looking at a 2-1 series where momentum has clearly shifted. The Wolves have shown they can not only compete with this Thunder team, but completely dominate them when they execute their game plan properly. I should also mention that the ball pressure on everybody who was Shai Gilgeous-Alexander went up to a completely different level in this game. The Wolves were making every Thunder player work for every touch, every pass, every dribble. When SGA was in the game, and I mean even when he was actively playing, the Thunder still couldn't generate much of anything offensively. But when he was on the floor, particularly during that stretch in the early second quarter, the Thunder were completely lost. Despite making however many passes they wanted and setting however many screens they could think of, they absolutely could not get anything going inside. It felt like during that early second quarter stretch when SGA was sitting on the bench, the Thunder offense just completely stagnated. They had no answers for the defensive pressure and intensity the Wolves were bringing. Mike Conley's plus-minus continues to be a fascinating subplot in this series. If you want to pay attention to advanced statistics, his impact on winning and losing has been remarkable, even when his traditional box score numbers might not jump off the page. It's a perfect example of how basketball impact goes far beyond just points, rebounds, and assists. Then we had Terrence Shannon Jr. getting some meaningful minutes, which was a cool little storyline. I remember saying positive things about him during Summer League, pointing out just how ruthless he was when driving to the basket. I believe the exact phrase I used to describe Terrence Shannon Jr. during Summer League was that I was getting some Corey Maggot vibes from how he was getting downhill. His ability to attack the rim with aggression and physicality really stood out even in those early glimpses. Now, I have absolutely no idea if we should realistically expect consistent contributions from him for the rest of this series. It might be asking too much from a young player in his first playoff experience. But it was definitely a cool moment to see him get an opportunity and make the most of it. Sometimes in playoff series, unexpected players step up and make meaningful contributions. And it's always exciting when that happens. Whether Shannon can continue to provide valuable minutes remains to be seen. But the fact that he's even in the rotation speaks to how much the Wolves needed to shake things up. As always in modern NBA basketball, whether threes are going in or not dictates so much of what happens in any given game. But watching SGA go from doing basically whatever he wanted, especially in that previous game, to today's completely different performance was striking. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. From complete control to looking genuinely uncomfortable and rushed. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the direct result of the defensive adjustments and increased pressure the Wolves brought to this game. Before I wrap up, I want to do one quick aside about the Knicks Spacers series, specifically Game 2, because I was discussing Mitchell Robinson's minutes and usage earlier. It really does feel like when Mitchell has his full stamina and energy, that represents the absolute best version of the Knicks with him on the floor. His rim protection, rebounding, and overall presence in the paint transforms their entire defensive identity. However, given how the Pacers play their style of basketball, and considering how much Mitchell battles on the glass and exerts energy on every possession, it might simply not be realistic to ask him to play in the mid-30s for minutes consistently. The physical toll of playoff basketball is immense, and big men especially feel that wear and tear. Everyone seems to be criticizing Tom Thibodeau for his rotations and pointing to the net rating of the starting five in these playoffs, which has actually been negative over 300 minutes of play. But here's the reality that people might be overlooking. Thibodeau only has 2 players coming off his bench that he truly trusts in crucial playoff moments. When you're dealing with that kind of limited depth, your rotation decisions become incredibly difficult. Looking ahead, I honestly don't know what's going to happen in the rest of these series. But what I do know is that basketball has been absolutely fantastic to watch, and nights like this remind us why we love this game so much. The adjustments, the counter-adjustments, the individual performances, the team execution, it all came together for one spectacular evening of playoff basketball.